The glint of a silver bullet lodged in Bryce Dawson's shoulder reflected the Montana sunset as he staggered through the doorway of the town's only medical office, leaving a trail of blood behind him. The year was 1878, and Timber Creek was still reeling from the railroad's recent arrival, bringing with it prosperity, strangers, and trouble. Madeline Daniels looked up from her medical journal, her 24 years of life having prepared her for many things, but the sight of the infamous rancher bleeding across her freshly swept floor wasn't one of them. She had arrived in Timber Creek just 3 months prior, answering the town's desperate call for a medical professional after the previous doctor had succumbed to pneumonia. "Mr. Dawson," she said calmly, rising from her desk, "I see you've decided to make my acquaintance in the most dramatic fashion possible." Bryce winced, his weathered face contorting with pain. At 32, he'd built the largest cattle operation in the territory, earning both respect and enemies along the way. His piercing blue eyes, now clouded with agony, fixed on the young woman in the simple blue dress. "They said I needed a nurse," he managed through gritted teeth. "Didn't mention she'd be so capable," Madeline finished for him, already guiding him toward the examination table. "Let's save the pleasantries for when you're not bleeding on my floor." The bullet had torn through muscle but missed anything vital. As Madeline worked, the silence between them was broken only by the occasional sharp intake of breath from Bryce as she probed the wound. "Who did this?" she asked, reaching for her forceps. "Man doesn't take kindly to losing at cards," Bryce replied, his voice tight. "Especially when he's convinced I cheated." "And did you?" A shadow of a smile crossed his face. "A gentleman never reveals his secrets, Miss Daniels. And a doctor never reveals her patient's confessions," she countered, dropping the extracted bullet into a metal dish with a satisfying clink. "Though I doubt you're much of a gentleman, Mr. Dawson." The sound of hoofbeats outside interrupted their exchange. Sheriff Wilkins appeared at the doorway, his hand resting casually on his holster. "Dawson," the sheriff nodded, "heard there was trouble at the saloon." "Jameson's mighty upset about losing his month's wages." Bryce attempted to shrug but winced at the movement. "Man shouldn't wager what he can't afford to lose." Sheriff Wilkins sighed, removing his hat. "Miss Daniels, once you've patched up our local troublemaker, I'd appreciate if he'd come make a statement." After the sheriff departed, Madeline continued her work in silence, her nimble fingers stitching the wound closed with practiced precision. "You've got quite the touch," Bryce observed. "Where'd a young woman learn such skills?" "My father was a surgeon in Chicago," she replied without looking up. "I assisted him from the time I could hold instruments steady. Then I attended the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, not that it's any of your business." "A proper education," Bryce said with genuine admiration. "Timber Creek is lucky to have you." Madeline tied off the last stitch. "It wasn't exactly my first choice, but opportunities for female doctors are limited even in 1878. "Why leave Chicago?" A shadow crossed Madeline's face. "My father died. The practice went to his male associate, despite my superior qualifications." She began wrapping clean bandages around Bryce's shoulder. "The advertisement said Timber Creek needed a doctor. They didn't specify a gender, and by the time they realized I was a woman, they were desperate enough to hire me anyway." "Their desperation is my good fortune tonight," Bryce said quietly. Madeline stepped back to assess her handiwork. "You'll need to keep the wound clean. Return in 3 days so I can check for infection." As Bryce eased himself off the table, he reached for his wallet, but Madeline shook her head. "Your money's no good here until I'm certain my work holds up. Come back in 3 days, then we'll discuss payment." Bryce studied her for a moment. "Has anyone ever told you that you're unusual, Miss Daniels?" "Frequently," she replied, already clearing away her supplies, "and rarely as a compliment." "It was meant as one," he said, donning his hat with his good arm. At the doorway, he paused. "Thank you, Doc." 3 days later, Bryce returned as instructed. The morning was bright, and Madeline had just finished setting a young boy's broken arm when the cowboy's tall frame filled her doorway. "Right on time, Mr. Dawson. I'm impressed with your obedience." "My foreman threatened to tie me to my horse and deliver me himself if I didn't show," Bryce admitted, settling onto the examination table. Apparently, I've been, and I quote, meaner than a wounded grizzly since our last encounter. Madeline's lips curved slightly as she unwrapped his bandages. And are you normally so disagreeable, or is it just the gunshot wound bringing out your charming personality? The wound was healing nicely, with no signs of infection. As she gently probed the area, she noticed Bryce watching her intently. You have a gentle touch for someone with such a sharp tongue, he observed. And you have remarkable healing for a man who likely ignored all my advice about taking it easy, she countered, applying fresh bandages. What exactly does taking it easy mean to a rancher anyway? I only rounded up half the cattle I normally would, he said with a straight face. Madeline shook her head in exasperation. Well, despite your best efforts to the contrary, you're healing well. As she finished redressing his wound, the door to the clinic burst open and Mrs. Peterson rushed in, her face contorted with worry. Doc Daniels, it's my Robert, he's having one of his spells again. Madeline immediately switched focus. Where is he? Home. The boys carried him back after he collapsed in the field. I'll gather my supplies, Madeline said, already moving to her cabinet. Bryce stood, adjusting his shirt. I can drive you, my wagon's outside. Madeline gave him a questioning look, but there wasn't time to argue. Minutes later, they were racing toward the Peterson farm, dust billowing behind the wagon. Robert has a heart condition, Madeline explained as they bounced along the rutted road. His father died of the same ailment at 40, Robert's only 35. The Peterson homestead came into view, a modest cabin with several outbuildings. Before the wagon had fully stopped, Madeline was jumping down, medical bag in hand. Inside, she found Robert Peterson lying on his bed, pale and struggling for breath. For the next hour, Bryce watched from the doorway as Madeline worked, administering medication, checking his pulse, and giving calm instructions to his wife. By the time Robert's breathing had steadied and color returned to his face, the sun was beginning to set. Madeline gave Mrs. Peterson detailed instructions before finally stepping outside, exhaustion evident in her slumped shoulders. I didn't know doctoring could be so intense, Bryce said quietly as they walked back to the wagon. Every day is different, she replied, climbing up to the seat. Some days it's setting bones and stitching wounds. Others, it's fighting to keep someone's heart beating. They rode in comfortable silence as twilight descended over the landscape. The vast Montana sky stretched endlessly above them, stars beginning to appear like scattered diamonds. You're good at what you do, Bryce finally said. Better than old Doc Miller ever was. Madeline glanced at him. High praise coming from someone who probably avoided doctors until a bullet forced his hand. Fair assessment, he conceded with a slight smile. Though I might be persuaded to change my ways. When they reached town, Bryce insisted on seeing her safely to her door, a small apartment above the clinic. At her doorstep, he hesitated. I still owe you for patching me up. Madeline studied him in the dim light. Consider it settled if you promise to be more careful at card games. I make no promises I can't keep, Doc, he said with a grin, but I could bring you dinner tomorrow, as payment. The invitation caught her off guard. That's not necessary. Not necessary, he agreed, but perhaps pleasant. Unless you find my company intolerable. Madeline considered him for a moment. 7 o'clock, and nothing extravagant. This is purely a professional arrangement. Bryce tipped his hat. Purely professional, he echoed, though his eyes suggested otherwise. True to his word, Bryce arrived the following evening with a basket containing a surprisingly well-prepared meal: roast chicken, fresh bread, and even apple pie from the town bakery. I didn't take you for a man who could cook, Madeline remarked as they sat at her small table. I can't, he admitted, but Mrs. Reynolds at the ranch can. She was quite insistent that I bring enough food to put some meat on your bones, as she put it. The evening passed more pleasantly than Madeline had anticipated. Bryce was surprisingly well-read for a rancher, and their conversation ranged from literature to politics to the changing landscape of the West. What brought you to ranching? She asked as they shared the pie. Bryce leaned back in his chair, absently touching his healing shoulder. I came west after the war like many men, I suppose. Spent a few years drifting, working cattle drives until I won a small parcel of land in a poker game. Of course you did, she said with a smile. It wasn't much, just enough for a cabin and a few head of cattle, but I added to it year by year. Bought land when I could, won some more in cards, he grinned. Now the Double D Ranch covers more acres than I ever dreamed of owning. Double D, Dawson Domain, he explained. My father always said a man should build something that outlasts him. I suspect he meant a family, but the land was easier to come by. There was something in his tone that suggested a deeper story, but Madeline didn't press. Instead, she found herself sharing her own journey, her battle to be taken seriously in medicine, the loss of her father, her decision to come west. Chicago's loss is definitely Timber Creek's gain, Bryce said as the evening drew to a close. At her door, he paused. I'd like to do this again, Doc. I believe your debt is paid in full, Mr. Dawson. Then perhaps next time could be simply for the pleasure of your company. Madeline hesitated. I don't socialize much with patients. Then it's fortunate I'm almost healed, he replied with a smile that reached his eyes. Good night, Doc. Over the following weeks, Bryce found numerous reasons to visit the clinic: a check on his shoulder, a cut on his hand, a sprained ankle. Each injury minor, each visit extending longer than medically necessary. You're the clumsiest rancher I've ever encountered, Madeline observed one afternoon as she bandaged a shallow cut on his forearm. Or the most determined, he countered. Spring blossomed into early summer, bringing with it new challenges. A measles outbreak kept Madeline working day and night for nearly 2 weeks. To her surprise, Bryce appeared at the clinic daily, bringing food, fresh water, and occasionally simply sitting with the most frightened children while she treated others. You don't have to do this, she told him one evening as they sat on the clinic's porch, finally catching a moment of rest after the crisis had passed. I know, he said simply, handing her a cup of coffee. The town noticed their growing friendship. Whispers followed Madeline at church and in the general store, some amused, some disapproving. A female doctor was unusual enough. One who kept company with the town's most eligible bachelor was downright scandalous. People are talking, she told Bryce one day as they rode out to check on an elderly patient outside town. People always talk, he replied unconcernedly. Especially in small towns where entertainment is limited. It could damage my reputation as a doctor. Bryce gave her a sidelong glance. Has anyone stopped coming to you for treatment? No, she admitted. In fact, I've been busier than ever. Then perhaps it's not your professional reputation you're worried about. Madeline didn't answer, but she knew he was right. What troubled her wasn't the possibility of losing patients, but of losing her heart. She had come to Timber Creek to practice medicine, not to fall for a charming cowboy with a penchant for finding trouble. Yet as spring turned to summer, she found herself looking forward to his visits, enjoying their debates and admiring his unexpected kindness. When he invited her to a July 4th celebration at his ranch, she surprised herself by accepting. The Double D Ranch was even more impressive than she had imagined. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure of solid timber, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Outbuildings, corrals, and bunkhouses spread outward from it, and beyond them stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed. It's beautiful, she admitted as Bryce helped her down from the wagon. It's home, he said simply, but the pride in his voice was unmistakable. The celebration was in full swing, with ranch hands and neighboring families gathered for food, music, and dancing. Madeline found herself warmly welcomed, particularly by Mrs. Reynolds, the matronly housekeeper who had prepared the meal Bryce had brought her months ago. About time he brought you out here, the older woman said, pulling Madeline aside. He's been talking about nothing but Doc Daniels for months. As darkness fell, lanterns illuminated the yard and a fiddler struck up a lively tune. Bryce appeared at Madeline's side, extending his hand. May I have this dance, Doc? Under the stars, with the music swirling around them and the warm summer night enveloping them, Madeline felt something shift. As Bryce's arm encircled her waist, drawing her closer than was strictly proper, she realized fighting her feelings was becoming increasingly futile. Later, as they walked along the creek that gave the town its name, Bryce stopped beneath a massive cottonwood tree. I've been meaning to ask you something, he said, his usual confidence replaced by uncharacteristic hesitation. Yes, there's a medical conference in Denver next month. The ranch has some business there as well. I thought perhaps we could. A shout from the direction of the house interrupted him. One of the ranch hands was running toward them, his face urgent in the moonlight. Boss, trouble at the north pasture fence looks like rustlers. Bryce's expression hardened instantly. Get the men, he ordered, then turned to Madeline. I'm sorry, I need to go, she said, understanding the urgency. Hours passed with no word. Madeline remained at the main house with Mrs. Reynolds, both women tense as they waited for news. When the men finally returned well after midnight, two were injured, one with a gunshot wound to the leg. Without hesitation, Madeline went to work, converting the dining table into an operating area. As she extracted the bullet from the young ranch hand's thigh, she was acutely aware of Bryce watching her, his face grim. Will he ride again? He asked when she had finished, with time and proper care. Yes, she assured him, wiping blood from her hands. What happened out there? Rustlers, the same crew that's been hitting ranches up and down the valley, Bryce explained, pouring himself a whiskey. They got away with about 20 head before we intercepted them, and the other men, some cuts and bruises, nothing serious. His voice was tight with anger, not at her, she knew, but at the situation. I'm sorry your evening ended this way. Don't be, she said, touching his arm gently. This is what I do. As dawn broke, with the injured men resting comfortably, Bryce insisted on driving Madeline back to town. The wagon ride was quiet, both of them exhausted from the night's events. At her door, he finally spoke. You were amazing last night. Just doing my job. No, he said, taking her hand. It was more than that. You didn't panic, didn't hesitate. You saved Tom's leg, maybe his life. Bryce, the conference, he interrupted. In Denver. Will you come? Not as my doctor, but as my guest. Madeline hesitated, aware of the implications. Traveling together would cement the rumors already circulating about them. But looking into his eyes, she found she cared less about those whispers than she had before. Yes, she said simply. I'll come. The journey to Denver took 3 days by train, 3 days of landscapes changing from Montana's rugged wilderness to Colorado's dramatic mountains. They stayed in separate compartments, maintaining propriety, but spent their days together in the passenger car, talking, reading, or simply watching the world pass by the window. Denver was bustling with activity, a city growing rapidly as the gateway to the mountains and their mining wealth. The medical conference was being held at one of the city's grandest hotels, and Bryce had secured rooms for them there. Separate rooms, he assured her with a smile that suggested he'd anticipated her concern. On different floors. The conference itself was enlightening. Madeline found herself surrounded by fellow medical professionals for the first time since leaving Philadelphia. Most were men, of course, but there were a handful of other women pioneers like herself, carving out spaces in a profession reluctant to accept them. It's refreshing to be treated as a doctor first and a woman second, she told Bryce over dinner at an elegant restaurant on their 3rd evening in Denver. In Timber Creek, I'm always the lady doctor, as if my gender defines my practice. And here I'm simply a rural physician exchanging knowledge with colleagues, she smiled. Though I've noticed several curious glances at my handsome escort, apparently I'm the envy of several female attendees. Bryce grinned. Only several, I must be losing my touch. The easy banter between them had become comfortable, but beneath it ran a current of tension neither had addressed directly. Each evening, when he escorted her to her door, there was a moment, a pause filled with unspoken possibilities before they bid each other good night. On their final evening in Denver, after Bryce had concluded his business dealings, he surprised her with tickets to the opera, a performance of Verdi's La Traviata. I didn't know cowboys appreciated Italian opera, Madeline teased as they took their seats in the opulent theater. This cowboy appreciates beauty in all its forms, he replied, his gaze lingering on her face rather than the stage. The performance was magnificent, the tragic love story unfolding in glorious music that filled the theater. Madeline found herself moved to tears by the finale. As they left, Bryce guided her through the crowded lobby with a hand at the small of her back, a gesture both protective and possessive. Outside, the night air was cool and clear, the streets of Denver quieter now as the hour grew late. They walked slowly back toward their hotel, neither in a hurry to end the evening. "Thank you," Madeline said softly. "Not just for tonight, but for bringing me here. It's been wonderful." Bryce stopped, turning to face her under the glow of a street lamp. "Madeline," he began, the rare use of her first name catching her attention. "These past months since you extracted that bullet from my shoulder, Mr. Dawson, what a surprise." The moment was shattered by a booming voice. A heavyset man in an expensive suit approached them, hand extended toward Bryce. "Thomas," Bryce acknowledged with barely concealed irritation. "I didn't realize you were in Denver. Just arrived yesterday, business with the railroad." The man's gaze shifted to Madeline, his expression openly appraising. "And who is this lovely lady?" "Dr. Madeline Daniels," Bryce introduced her, emphasizing her title. "The physician from Timber Creek." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "A female doctor, how progressive of Montana territory." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Before Madeline could respond, Bryce's voice cut through the night air, cold and sharp. "Dr. Daniels is one of the finest physicians I've ever encountered. Her gender is irrelevant to her skills, though clearly not to your limited perspective." Thomas's face reddened. "I meant no offense, yet you managed to cause it nonetheless," Bryce interrupted. "If you'll excuse us, we were just returning to our hotel." As they walked away, Madeline squeezed Bryce's arm gently. "That wasn't necessary, but thank you." "It was absolutely necessary," he replied, still visibly annoyed. "Men like Thomas Richardson represent everything that's backward about society, judging people by arbitrary characteristics rather than their true worth." At the hotel, the interrupted moment from earlier seemed to hang between them as they ascended the grand staircase. At her door, Madeline turned to face him. "What were you going to say before we were interrupted?" Bryce stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I was going to say that meeting you has changed something in me, that for the first time since coming west, I'm thinking about more than just the next season, the next herd, the next expansion of the ranch." His hand came up to cup her face, his touch gentle. "I'm thinking about a future that includes more than just land and cattle, a future with someone by my side who challenges me, impresses me, and makes me want to be better than I am." Madeline's heart raced. "Bryce, you don't need to say anything now," he said softly. "We return to Timber Creek tomorrow. Take time to think about what I'm saying, what I'm asking." He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to step away, but she remained still, her eyes locked with his. When his lips met hers, the kiss was gentle at first, then deepening with a passion that left her breathless. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were dark with emotion. "Good night, Doc," he whispered, stepping back. "Good night," she managed, her voice unsteady. The return journey to Timber Creek seemed both faster and more charged with unspoken emotions. Back in town, life quickly resumed its normal patterns, Madeline treating patients, Bryce running his ranch. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that could no longer be dismissed as mere friendship. 2 weeks after their return, disaster struck. A fire broke out in the dry grass near town, whipped by strong winds into a raging inferno that threatened both Timber Creek and the surrounding ranches. The entire community mobilized, men fighting the flames, women preparing food and caring for children, and the elderly who had been evacuated from outlying areas. Madeline established a makeshift treatment center in the church, tending to burns, smoke inhalation, and injuries sustained in the frantic battle against the fire. Hour after hour, exhausted firefighters staggered in for treatment before returning to the front lines. By the second day, with the fire still advancing, she had seen no sign of Bryce. Reports from those coming in for treatment suggested he and his men were defending the northeastern boundary, where the fire threatened to jump the creek and engulf several smaller homesteads. On the third day, as the wind finally shifted and hope began to grow that the fire might be contained, a wagon rolled up to the church. 2 ranch hands carried in an unconscious figure, Bryce, his face blackened with soot, his clothes singed, his breathing labored. "Building collapsed," one of the men explained as they laid him on a pallet. He'd gone in to make sure everyone was out. Madeline's professional demeanor masked the fear that gripped her heart as she examined him. Burns on his hands and arms, a gash on his temple, and his lungs compromised by smoke, but he was alive. For the next day and night, she barely left his side, bathing his burns, monitoring his breathing, and whispering encouragements when delirium took him. When he finally opened his eyes, clear and alert, her relief was so profound she had to turn away to compose herself. "Easy there, Cowboy," she said, her voice steadier than her emotions. "You've given us quite a scare." Bryce's voice was rough from smoke and disuse. "They said I needed a nurse," he rasped, a shadow of his usual smile appearing through the grime on his face. "Then she healed more than my body." Madeline stilled, his words cutting through her professional facade. "What did you say?" His hand found hers, burns and all. "You heard me, Doc. From that first day, when you dug that bullet out of me, you've been healing parts of me I didn't even know were broken." Tears threatened to spill from Madeline's eyes. "That's just the delirium talking." "No," he insisted, his grip tightening on her hand. "It's the clearest I've been in years. Nearly dying has a way of crystallizing what's important." He paused, drawing a painful breath. "And you, Madeline Daniels, are what's important to me." It was another week before Bryce was well enough to leave the makeshift hospital. By then, the fire had been extinguished, leaving a swath of blackened earth but miraculously few casualties. The Double D Ranch had lost some grazing land and an outlying bunkhouse, but the main structures remained intact. As summer gave way to fall, Madeline found her relationship with Bryce deepening. Their shared experience during the fire had stripped away any remaining pretenses. When he formally courted her, bringing flowers to the clinic, escorting her to Sunday services, taking her on picnics by the creek, the town's gossip shifted from scandal to speculation about wedding dates. "You realize people are already planning our wedding." Madeline mentioned one crisp October afternoon as they rode across his property. "Are they now?" Bryce replied, amusement dancing in his eyes. "And what date have they settled on?" "Mrs. Peterson thinks spring would be most appropriate. Mrs. Wilkins disagrees, she's advocating for Christmas." "And what does Dr. Daniels think?" he asked, reining his horse to a stop beside a bluff overlooking the valley. Madeline regarded him thoughtfully. "Dr. Daniels thinks that's putting the cart rather before the horse, considering no one has actually proposed marriage." Bryce dismounted, then moved to help her down from her horse. As her feet touched the ground, he kept his hands at her waist, drawing her close. "I've been waiting for the right moment," he admitted. "Wanted it to be perfect. And is this it?" She asked, looking around at the autumn-painted landscape stretching before them. "It could be," he said, a new seriousness in his expression. "If you wanted it to be." Madeline felt her heart quicken. "Bryce Dawson, are you asking me something?" Instead of answering, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it revealed a ring not ostentatious, but beautifully crafted with a diamond flanked by two small sapphires. "I rode all the way to Helena to find this," he said softly. "Wanted something as unique as you are." Dropping to one knee, he took her hand in his. "Madeline Daniels, you came to Timber Creek to heal others, but in the process, you've healed me body, mind, and heart. I can't imagine my life without you in it. Will you marry me?" Madeline looked down at him, this man who had entered her clinic bleeding from a bullet wound and somehow wound up capturing her heart. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I will marry you." The ring slipped onto her finger as if it had been made for her. As Bryce rose and pulled her into an embrace, sealing their engagement with a kiss, Madeline knew that her journey west had led her exactly where she was meant to be. They were married on New Year's Day, 1879, in Timber Creek's small church, with the entire town in attendance. The bride wore blue, a doctor should be practical, she had declared, and carried a bouquet of winter greenery and white roses brought all the way from Denver. News of their marriage traveled faster than the stagecoach, reaching even Chicago, where Madeline's former colleagues marveled that the serious, dedicated young woman they had known had found love with a Montana rancher. Winter passed in a blur of happiness, the newlyweds dividing their time between the ranch and town. Bryce had converted one of the ranch's smaller buildings into a clinic, allowing Madeline to see patients there 2 days a week while maintaining her practice in town the rest of the time. Spring brought new beginnings. Madeline hired a young woman, Sarah Tompkins, as her assistant, training her in basic medical procedures to help manage the growing practice. Bryce expanded the ranch's operations. Adding sheep to their cattle interests a controversial decision among traditional cattlemen, but one that proved profitable. By summer, there was more news to celebrate. As they sat on the porch of their home one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and purple, Madeline took her husband's hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "It seems, Mr. Dawson, that you're about to have another patient under your roof." Bryce's expression transformed from confusion to wonder as understanding dawned. "You're certain?" "As certain as a doctor can be about her own condition," she confirmed with a smile. "Expected arrival sometime in January, a perfect anniversary gift, wouldn't you say?" The joy that spread across his face was matched only by the tenderness in his embrace as he pulled her to him, whispering promises and dreams for their growing family. The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. The upstairs bedroom adjacent to theirs was transformed into a nursery, with Bryce himself crafting a cradle from cottonwood. Madeline continued her practice, though she gradually reduced her hours as her condition advanced. The baby, a daughter they named Elizabeth Hope, arrived on a snow-covered night in early January 1880. Though Madeline had planned to have the town's midwife assist, the rapid progression of her labor left no time for summoning help. It was Bryce who delivered his own daughter, following Madeline's calm instructions even as she worked through her pain. "You're amazing," he told her afterward, watching in awe as she nursed their newborn. "Absolutely extraordinary. We make a good team," she replied with tired satisfaction. "Though I still maintain you're the clumsiest rancher I've ever met," he laughed, remembering their early days. "Only around you, Doc, only around you." The years that followed brought both joys and challenges. Timber Creek grew with the expansion of the railroad, bringing new residents and opportunities. Madeline's practice flourished, her reputation extending throughout the territory. The Double D Ranch prospered under Bryce's management, becoming one of the most respected operations in Montana. 2 more children joined their family, James Thomas in 1882 and Catherine Grace in 1885. Each birth strengthened the bond between Madeline and Bryce, their partnership deepening as they balanced the demands of their professional lives with the joys of parenthood. By the time Montana achieved statehood in 1889, the Dawsons were firmly established as leaders in their community. Bryce served on the territorial council during the transition to statehood, while Madeline helped establish a small hospital in the growing town. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Bryce surprised Madeline with a journey back to Denver, this time with their children left in the capable hands of Mrs. Reynolds, who had become more grandmother than housekeeper to the young Dawsons. In the same hotel where they had stayed a decade earlier, Bryce presented his wife with a leather-bound journal. Inside, she found newspaper clippings, pressed flowers, and handwritten notes documenting their journey together. "I've been collecting these since the day you removed that bullet," he explained as she turned the pages. "Thought our grandchildren might like to know how it all began someday." Madeline lingered over a page containing a dried flower. "Is this from the bluff where you proposed?" "It is," he confirmed. "I went back the next day to get it, wanted to remember everything about that moment." She closed the book carefully, looking up at the man who had changed her life in ways she could never have anticipated when she'd first arrived in Timber Creek. "When I came west, I thought I was just following the only opportunity available to me," she said softly. "I never imagined I'd find this, a partner, a family, a home." Bryce took her hands in his. "Do you remember what I said to you when I woke up after the fire?" "About you healing more than my body," she nodded, the memory still vivid after all these years. "It's still true," he said. "Every day with you heals something in me I didn't even know needed healing." "And you," she replied, "gave me a life richer than any I could have imagined for myself." Even in Chicago, even with all the opportunities I thought I wanted. Outside their window, the lights of Denver twinkled in the darkness. But both knew their real home waited for them in Timber Creek, the community they had helped build, the family they had created, and the love that had begun with a bullet wound and a sharp-tongued doctor who had indeed healed far more than just a body.